Hello, welcome to the Deep 404. Winter is coming to Ukraine. As Ukraine approaches its winter season, formally starting in December, temperatures are starting to drop. Reports this week are that in the Kherson region, temperatures are now starting to drop a few degrees below 0 Celsius. Kiev is looking at getting down to -8 degrees in the coming 10 days, -8 degrees Celsius, or about 17 degrees Fahrenheit. This is going to have an impact upon both Russian and Ukrainian combatants. This drop in temperature, which is leading to snow starting to fall now, does mean that we're coming to the end of the rapatista, which is the mud season, the period of time where fighting can be difficult, movement of vehicles can be hampered due to mud, where the rains have come and the temperatures haven't dropped for long enough to freeze the ground yet. So we're still in that at the moment, but moving over the next few weeks, a month, to a period of time where the ground will start to freeze, and full winter fighting can commence. Now, the challenges that we're going to start to see as it gets colder is slow down in the ability to use drones, so reconnaissance drones. And there's a number of reasons here. As the temperatures start to drop, we start to get fog. So fog causes a problem at low to medium levels. You obviously struggle to see where you are going if you are doing any activity that requires movement with fog around. For drones, this is also a problem unless you are able to get up above the fog. But even then, getting up above the fog and looking down onto a blanket of white isn't particularly helpful for you. So that's a problem for reconnaissance and drones. And remember that drones are the big game changer in this conflict. Much of the damage we have seen done to Ukrainian forces in the last couple of months have been due to Russian drones, whether they be all-land Lancet combinations working to destroy tanks and armoured equipment, or FPV drones being used sometimes in a one-on-one scenario, one drone sometimes targeting one serviceman or one soldier. So we will see a slowdown in the ability for these drones to operate, which will then lead to a slowdown in other areas. There has been a move during this conflict to rely upon drone-based reconnaissance for the targeting of artillery. So we might see now the inability to support some operations because of the inability to target artillery as accurately as we were previously. So fog is one issue here as we get colder. Snow is the other, and again, snow for a number of reasons. Thick drifts of snow make it difficult for men to move around. Snow itself, again, makes it difficult to perform reconnaissance activities. Particularly with the smaller FPV drones, if the temperatures are dropping to a level where we're getting snow, then you're starting to have an impact upon drone battery life. Now, drones, FPV drones, and a lot of these are commercial drones that are being used. They're cheap to purchase. They're readily produced in large numbers already, and they can rapidly be modified to the needs of the frontline conflict. However, they do, because they're commercial type pieces of equipment and not military grade in many cases, they do have limited operating temperature ranges in which they will operate well upon. Now, above 40 degrees, they're often rated as you might start to have problems. Getting below 0, you're going to start having problems with them. Batteries won't charge well in cold conditions, and they will bleed energy very quickly. So the range and duration that you might be able to use a drone for reconnaissance, or in an attack mode where you might be carrying a grenade, or you have a drone which is armed and are able to fly it into a piece of equipment or a target. Your ability to do that will decrease as the winter rolls on. What we might see as a consequence of this is perhaps a innovation in the field of battery conservation coming out of the next few months of this conflict. What that might look like, I don't know, but I'm sure that as the snowfalls are reportedly starting in Ukraine, already there will be soldiers on both sides, drone pilots on both Ukrainian and Russian sides, looking for ways to be able to prolong the use of their drone capability in this conflict. Now, the temperatures that we're talking about here, Ukraine has an average winter temperature of between minus 4.8 and 2 degrees Celsius, which is between 23 and 36 degrees Fahrenheit. And it can get down to minus 20 degrees Celsius, which is minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit. So as an indication, a regular household refrigerator in the fridge compartment will get down to about minus 4 degrees. If you really want your food cold, you might wind it down to minus 5 degrees. To 4 degrees or around 5 degrees Celsius. And in your freezer, it might get down to minus 18 degrees Celsius. So the average Ukrainian winter temperature is about the temperature inside your refrigerator at its peak. That's if it's getting up to the 2 or 3 degrees range. But overall, it will be lower than that. The average will be around freezing. And then the lower temperatures that Ukraine will get to in some areas and at some times during winter will be like sitting inside the freezer compartment. So this has, once you get down to those temperatures, you start to get all sorts of problems too. Mechanical issues become a problem. Metal materials start to get harder and colder and more brittle. Electronics start to face challenges. What also is going to become a struggle for anyone in a position where they are suffering from supply challenges. Consider Avdeevka at the moment, which is being cut off and put into a cauldron. The Ukrainians fighting there will find their morale dropping rapidly, as if they are unable to be resupplied with fuel for heating, very quickly they will start to suffer. Now, in the warmer months, this isn't a problem. You don't need to be concerned with warming yourself. If the ambient temperature is okay in spring, autumn, summertime, no problem. But if you're getting to the case where you are dealing with average temperatures of minus 4 degrees, then you need to be able to warm yourself to be able to continue to fight. If you are working in an environment where you don't have ready access to electricity, in the case where the electricity grid in your area may have been destroyed, rendered inoperable, then you are relying on fuel, liquid fuels primarily, oils and that sort of thing, to be able to burn, or diesels to be able to run generators to produce electricity. So if you are in somewhere like Avdeevka, where your supply line is dramatically threatened, then you are running the risk of hitting a situation where you are unable to heat yourself. Now, once you are unable to heat yourself, again, lighting fires with wood is not always advisable, as it's a fairly sure way to give away your location. So if you reach the situation where you're unable to warm yourself, this is when you will start to find real problems setting in. It becomes hard to cook food. People get hungry. If the temperatures stay low for a period of time, or if it rains and people get wet and then it gets cold, you start to run the risk of frostbite. Loss of fingers and toes, and that sort of thing. Very rapidly in those situations, people who may have continued fighting under harsh conditions in the summer are more likely to give up and to want to leave during those hard winter conditions. So as a town or a small city like Avdeevka comes under increasing Russian intensity in terms of attack and the assaults being laid upon it, as supplies cut to that town continue, and then as the temperature drops, the likelihood of more Ukrainian forces surrendering or choosing to just evacuate and leave Avdeevka rises. Now, this becomes a problem across the front line for Ukraine, and more so, I believe, than for the Russians. And for these reasons, if you consider the current front line where the Russians are driving westward, advancing westward, they are not suffering under the same sort of missile and drone attacks that the Ukrainians are. So the Russians are better capable to keep their supply lines operating. Also, as the Russians are moving westward, they're able to drag services like power with them. They can pull generators along with them. They can pull fuel because they have their open supply lines. And at a distance, they can maintain and repair the existing infrastructure. So while substations and power lines may have been destroyed as the fighting has progressed through an area, Russia, much like it is doing, for example, in the city of Mariupol, where it is rebuilding there, it can start to rebuild the infrastructure behind it and keep that access to power and heating oils and fuel closer to its front line. Now, the Ukrainians, from their front line, will be moving backwards as they're forced into retreat by the Russians, and they'll be moving backwards into an environment where, more than likely, the Russians have been conducting heavy missile strikes on fuel depots, trains, any sort of fuel tanking that they might be able to identify, and the electricity grid. Now, as I've mentioned before, the Russians, I imagine, in certain areas will be very targeted with the damage they do to Ukrainian electric grids. And what I mean here is that they will target smaller transformers and substations to leave smaller areas close to the front line unable to be powered, but retain the larger substations, so that if this is an area which Russia intends to hold when this conflict ends, that they haven't lost the transformers in those substations. Larger transformers are rare as hen's teeth. They're very expensive. They take a long lead time to produce. And so Russia would be aware of that. However, for the short term, and by doing damage to smaller transformers which can more easily be replaced, they certainly can, for a winter, take the power out to the Ukrainians in the main towns and areas that the Ukrainians would be likely to fall back to as they are pushed back into defensive locations by the Russians. So overall, the coming winter, I believe, will be harder on the Ukrainian forces than on the Russian forces. Again, I saw more footage today of a grouping of a large room or a hall of I believe they were new Ukrainian mobilized servicemen. It was interesting looking at that crowd that what I would guess to be the average age of that crowd is quite old. There were a large number of men who I would have picked as being 40s or 50s in age. Some younger ones, but a large number of older ones. Now, again, these men, yes, they are going to be tough in some respects because they're older. In other respects, they are going to very rapidly, I think, miss the warmth of their home, and are likely to be tough to control in a situation where the men are getting hungry and cold and starting to revolt against perhaps their young or inexperienced commanders. The opportunity for them to mutiny effectively and leave is, I think, quite possible that we'll see more of that happening as the conditions become worse. Things like fog and snow make all aspects of work harder to. Even things like the DRG groups, reconnaissance groups moving forwards. Now, while it provides, again, some ability for them to hide, it allows them to tactically perhaps advance, it still makes it difficult to be able to determine what is going on in the area that you've advanced into. So perhaps some benefits in terms of being able to move forward under the cover of fog, but then being able to actually identify what's in the area you are in, difficult under those conditions. Now, all of this coming winter and the challenges that brings is being compounded by reports today, Ukrainian reporting, that they are receiving 30% less of 155mm shells today, and this has occurred since the start of the Middle Eastern Israeli and Hamas conflict. So if this Ukrainian reporting is correct, we can see that the impact of the Middle East conflict is already having a detrimental effect on Ukraine's ability to continue to fight. There have also been reports, Russian reports, that the amount of artillery shelling that they are seeing coming from the Ukrainians in areas around Avdeevka, as one example, has been decreasing, and this has also been backed up by Ukrainian reports from some soldiers that they just are unable to return fire at the same volume as they're receiving from the Russian forces. The Russian drone industry, Russian President Vladimir Putin has reported that they are planning on training 1 million trained specialists by 2030, and even a feeling that that may not be enough. But they are looking to have 1 million Russians trained up in flying FPV drones and commanding unmanned aerial vehicles. These will no doubt be of all land and Lancet types as well. But you can see the commitment the Russians are putting into drone technology. Pardon me. And the Russians have a plan to grow the domestic production of the drones that they use from 50% to up over 80%. Now, today, a large number of their drones would come from China in the FPV space. I imagine that's where the bulk of them are coming from today. But like everything else in this war, which Russia needs to rely upon, there has been a large push for the domestic production of those materials to be increased, or if not increased, started within Russia, so that the reliance and dependence upon other nations for those materials is reduced. This has been happening in the field of electronics is one good example. The Russians are working on developing their own chip manufacturing capabilities so as to move away from China, the US, and Taiwan. Now, Taiwan is a major manufacturer of microprocessor chips, computer chips. However, there is risk around Taiwan that if something were to occur there, due to the American-Chinese conflict over Taiwan, that Russia could be seen unable to obtain chips from there, hence the domestic production and boost in that area. Although all that sort of domestic work seems to be paying off for the Russian economy, Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin has reported a 5.5% economic growth last month, and that the yearly economic growth in Russia will be over 3%. Previously, they had been estimating around 2.5 or 2.7%, but now they're saying with confidence that it will be over 3%. So this is while nations in Europe are struggling with recession and not this sort of growth at all. It certainly seems as though the approach from early 2022 to enforce sanctions on Russia and oil price caps, which were intended to crush the Russian economy, have instead led to a boomerang effect where the lack of cheap Russian gas and oil has been felt by European nations who have been forced to purchase through third-party intermediaries at a higher price, at a premium. The lack of other Russian goods flowing to those nations appears to have been problematic, and they just don't seem to have dealt well with the conflict, and their economies are struggling more so, it seems, than Russia, which has adopted a war footing and is now having a labour shortage problem due to the fact of this increase in domestic production for war-based materials, where so many people now are employed that they're looking for more labour to be able to continue that domestic production. Finland has announced that it's closing its borders with Russia. It's suggesting that this will be a temporary measure. However, Finland has accused Moscow of weaponizing asylum seekers and sending undocumented migrants who are originating from Africa and the Middle East, who are arriving in Russia, and sending them across the border to Finland. Russia are denying this. Finland are claiming that it is happening. I'm not there on the border at the checkpoints to be able to determine if this is happening, if there are large numbers of African and Middle Eastern migrants moving from Russia into Finland. But if it is happening, it does underscore the challenge that European nations are having at the moment with their immigration policies, particularly becoming concerning for some nations now. France is one example where they now have concerns that if the Middle East conflict erupts into a West versus the Muslim world, that those European nations with high levels of Muslim immigrants may begin to suffer under domestic turmoil and domestic terrorism type activities. So while there have been some isolated incidents of this since the October 7 Hamas attacks on Israel, people are speculating that if the conflict does expand further, if Hezbollah become more involved, if the Houthis of Yemen become more involved, or if it even extends further and Turkey and Iran become involved, that at that point there may be a more global unrest among Muslim followers of Islam and Muslim supporters of the Hamas cause in Gaza. Another seemingly unintended consequence of the UK NATO involvement in the conflict in Ukraine is that apparently reports are that radiation levels in European nations are rising. The European Committee on Radiation Risk has registered elevated uranium particle content in the air in southeastern England, and this is reported as having been carried across by air masses from western Ukraine. Now, the reason suggested for this is due to the depleted uranium 150 or 152 millimeter or 125 millimeter tank shells that were provided by the UK to go with the Challenger tanks. That some of these stockpiles, there have been a number of reports of ammunition dumps destroyed, targeted by the Russians by missile strikes and destroyed, which were believed to house this depleted uranium ammunition. And if that is correct, this is what the thinking is as to where this increased radiation level has come from. It has been due to the destruction and explosion of those ammunition dumps containing the depleted uranium shells, and that has ejected into the air this radiation, which has now travelled westwards across the European nations and is being detected now in the UK. Now, the reporting, I haven't read deeper into it to see if the reporting has spread elsewhere, if it's only travelled west or where it has gone, but this is what the reporting from the European Committee on Radiation Risk, the ECRR, has been. Now, one interesting thing to note, exports from Turkey to Russia are declining. Now, in the recent months, this has been reported. Turkish exports to Russia decreased 11% in August and 25% in September and again in October. And this appears to be directly due to the increase in trade between Russia and China. So Russia is now importing more goods from. So Russia is now importing more goods from China and less from Turkey. This perhaps weakening of economic ties with Russia and an increase with China is something that I imagine that President Erdogan of Turkey will be very aware of. Russia being such a close neighbour for Turkey, obviously a large trading partner, this is something that I imagine that President Erdogan will be aware of and watching closely and wanting to find ways to address. And this, I feel, may lead to ultimately perhaps a close alignment of economic ideas between Turkey and Russia. I get the sense that if this continues, President Erdogan will look to do what he can to improve relations with President Putin and Russia so as to find avenues to uplift or sustain the current exports from Turkey to Russia. Seeing them all bleed out and go to China, clearly that is something that Erdogan does not want to see. It does show a strengthening of the ties between China and Russia, which is to be expected. The relationship there is clearly very, very good. We see that when delegates from Russia or China visit the opposite nation, the way that they are treated, just the open friendliness and warmth that you can see between the likes of Putin and Xi Jinping when they meet. Oppose this to the recent meeting with Xi and American President Joe Biden. The meeting there for Joe Biden was a disaster. If you've seen the footage of US Secretary of State Tony Blinken watching from the front row as Biden speaks and is talking to the media, and he's asked if he stands by his previous statement that Xi is a dictator, you see Tony's ears prick up, and then you see his face drop as President Biden says, yes, I stand by it, he is a dictator. This is a sensitive topic, something which everyone is well aware that regardless of what Biden might think, if he is looking to repair relations and de-escalate with China, then that's not the right thing to say. Biden's performance overall was, as expected, poor. The man is suffering from dementia. He's clearly not strong as a leader of the United States. What was telling was the dinner held and a few nights later, where I think we got to see the real meetings happening. This was a meeting which was attended by Ray Dalio and the head of Apple, Tim Cook, and Elon Musk, and the big businessmen of the United States had dinner with Xi. And I got the sense that that's where we were really being told how the relationships will move ahead between the US and China. It will be on the economic front and developed between those CEOs, and less so by Joe Biden. Other inflammatory things that came out of the meeting was Biden doubling down on the fact that they will continue to provide military aid to Taiwan. Now, Joe Biden could have really made this a successful event by not calling Xi a dictator and suggesting that while he was saying that the US will adhere and believes in the one China policy, to actually have done something to indicate that is what the US will actually do and what they really mean. While the US has said this since the 70s, Biden's actions of arming Taiwan indicates the opposite. Now, the Taiwan situation is one where you could imagine that the US could step back from Taiwan and de-escalate that situation. Any conflict over Taiwan that actually gets to a hot conflict and involves the US fighting China over Taiwan is going to be less than positive for the United States. The Chinese armed forces are very strong. They're fighting from their home base right near Taiwan. They're not going to be extended across an ocean like the United States will be. The States, of course, is strengthening its ties with Japan and South Korea. It is doing a deal to sell another 400 or supply another 400 Tomahawk missiles to Japan. So clearly, if this conflict were to occur, the United States will be looking at using the Philippines and Japan and Korea as its base. Still, a lot of its armed forces are a long way from home. China have submarines out in the South China Sea, which will no doubt be prepared and waiting for the US submarines. So it's going to be a conflict which even the Pentagon in their wargaming have reported looks unfavourable for the US. I think in all of their scenarios, there were very few in which they could find a way in which the US would be likely to win a conflict with China over Taiwan. Given that, you almost wonder if the Americans might step back, particularly as it seems that in the upcoming January 2024 elections in Taiwan, that the opposition parties who are polling around 20% each against the Democratic People's Party, who is in power at the moment, who are polling in about 35-38%. They have united. They are joining together to prepare for this election. So, you may find some sort of activity done there which would lead to a China-friendly leadership taking control in this next election. That may then leave the US hanging out to dry here, where if the Taiwanese government were to say, yep, we agree with the One China policy, we are part of China and we're going to work towards that and assimilating back into China, suddenly then the US are left with no point for being in Taiwan at all. Look, I might just finish off this one with a little bit of a talk about what has happened just in the last day over the front line. Oh, one last thing, that's right. Just in the UK of interest, Rishi Sunak has given peerage to David Cameron. He's made David Cameron, he's made him the Foreign Secretary, and he's the ex-PM of the UK from 2010 to 2016. He's made him a Lord, a member of the House of Lords. And this has been to allow him to gain access to Parliament. Lords can just be given their role like that. They're not elected into that role by the general public. This is going to allow David Cameron with the role of the Foreign Secretary. It's often called a Foreign Minister in other countries. What this gives David Cameron control over in the UK is British relations with foreign countries and governments, the promotion of British interests abroad, matters pertaining to the Commonwealth of Nations and the overseas territories. So things like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, as an example, are in the Commonwealth. Oversight for the Secret Intelligence, MI6, and the Government Communication Headquarters, the GCHQ. David Cameron was PM when NATO was involved in the overthrow of the Libyan Gaddafi government. So David Cameron coming in, going to be in control of foreign policy. Will be interesting to see just what he does in this role in the coming months in terms of the Ukraine conflict. Now, again, remember, for the British, the Ukraine, or the loss of the Ukraine conflict perhaps has a larger real impact for them, being closer to Europe than it does for the US. So it'll be interesting to see what David Cameron does there. All right, just a little quick update on what's happened over the last 24 hours in Ukraine in the frontline fighting. This is from the Russian Ministry of Defense reporting. The Kupiansk direction, which is where the Zapad group of forces operate, they've been operating with aviation, artillery, and their heavy flamethrower, the TOS-1 thermobaric system. They have repelled 3 attacks launched by assault groups of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the AFU's 30th Mechanized Brigade, close to Zagoryokovka in the Kharkov region. Members of the Ukrainian 14th, 41st Mechanized and 57th Motorized Infantry Brigades have been damaged by these attacks near Kurilovka, Podoli, Timkovka and Sinkovka. Reportedly, the Armed Forces of Ukraine servicemen losses were 30 servicemen, 3 motor vehicles, as well as 2 S1 Gvozdika self-propelled artillery system. Now, losing artillery systems for the Ukrainians is becoming a bigger and bigger problem for them, given the difficulties they will have now of being able to replace these pieces of equipment. As European and NATO nations are one by one indicating no longer providing direct military assistance, not providing these pieces of equipment anymore. This means that with each one of these that is lost, the Ukrainians are weakened in terms of counteracting Russian artillery duels, which means they are more likely to be pushed back and they are less likely to be able to launch successful attacks on Russian positions. In the Krasny-Liman direction, as we move further south, this is where the centre group of forces operate. They have reportedly been utilising helicopters and artillery to repel one attack launched by the 50th National Guard Regiment near Grigorovka in the Donetsk People's Republic. Also, Russian attacks in this area have taken their toll on the Ukrainian 67th Mechanised Brigade and the 125th Territorial Defence Brigade, Kosta Yampolovka and Serebyanka in the Donetsk People's Republic. Reportedly, this is the Russian Ministry of Defence reporting that 50 troops were killed and or wounded and 2 motor vehicles were lost in this area. Moving into Donetsk, in the Donetsk direction, which is where the Yug group of forces operate, they have been utilising heavy flamethrowers and artillery. They repelled one attack launched by an assault group of the 67th Mechanised Brigade close to Kleshchiivka in the Donetsk People's Republic. Also, Russian attacks were launched on the 28th and 30th Mechanised Brigades of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And damage was suffered by these brigades near Vasylikovka and Kurdyumovka in the Donetsk People's Republic. Reportedly, Ukrainians have lost 130 servicemen killed and wounded in the last day's fighting in Donetsk, as well as 2 armoured fighting vehicles, 3 motor vehicles. During counter-battery warfare, 2 M-Star-B howitzers, 1 Gvozdika self-propelled artillery system, and 1 D-30 gun were hit. So again, in the Donetsk area where fighting has been very heavy, in Avdeevka, in Bakhmut, south of Bakhmut, Kleshchiivka and Andriivka. Kleshchiivka is now being attacked from multiple directions, from the north, from the northeast across the rail line, and now reportedly as Andriivka has been evacuated by the Ukrainians. It's in the grey zone. There are no Ukrainians trying to hold that area anymore. The Russians are now able to proceed up from the south towards Kleshchiivka. So it's also very likely that in the next few days that we may see further Ukrainian losses and retreat from Kleshchiivka, which will then be seen as a win for the Russians in securing the southern flank of Bakhmut as fighting continues on the northwestern side of Bakhmut, and there are reportedly Russian advances in that area too. Now, in Avdeevka, as I've talked about in yesterday's episode, what appears now to be growing into a rout by the Russians of the Ukrainian forces through the bottom 4/5 of Avdeevka continues. There are more reports of Russian advances. One thing that's interesting to note here is the push northwards from the northern pincer above Avdeevka. So while the Russians are pushing down into Avdeevka, they've also been pushing north. And I understand the tactic here in doing this has been to push back Ukrainian artillery, to push it back and up and away so that it is unable to support Avdeevka. So that widening of that top northern pincer while they obviously are pushing down into Avdeevka, they're also pushing up to push artillery support away, leaving Avdeevka more exposed to the Russian assaults. Moving to the South Donetsk region, the Vostok group of forces are operating here, using artillery fire, and they have been repelling assaults from the 79th Air Assault Brigade near Novomykolaivka in the Donetsk People's Republic. Here, reportedly, up to 70 Ukrainian troops were lost, along with 2 infantry fighting vehicles and 2 motor vehicles. In the Zaporozhye direction, here in Zaporozhye and perhaps even South Donetsk, there's been some video footage which has come out, which I believe is in these regions, of the Russians starting now to use a cluster munition. I don't know what size cluster munition this was, but the area covered by it in the video that I saw was frightening, impressive. This was a large cluster munition that is being used. It looked like it would have been hundreds of meters in it long, the area that was just lighting up with cluster munitions. But in this Zaporozhye region, again, airstrikes and artillery fire. Again, we're seeing reported here in almost all areas that there are airstrikes, that close combat aircraft, and in a number of these areas, these will be the Kh-52 helicopters are operating. There have been no reports from either Ukrainian or Russian channels for weeks now of any Russian aircraft losses, yet there have been many reports of Ukrainian aircraft being lost, the least of which these reports that came out over the weekend of an Su-27, a Ukrainian Su-27, and its pilot, apparently a flight commander, flying his craft to Russia. While I've not seen images or video of the plane having landed and complete confirmation of that, there are a number of sources that have been reporting that did occur. So unless that has changed in the last few hours, I believe that to be an event that has occurred. But the Russians able to operate with air superiority along the front line. I did see on Twitter a Ukrainian account claiming that Russia had no Kh-52 helicopters left. This was pretty rapidly shot down. Even another pro-Ukrainian account replied with some visual investigation that they had done, and they were able to clearly show that there were still large numbers of Kh-52s operational in Russia. Combine this with the fact that the Russians are no doubt producing more of these as we speak. I don't think that the Russians are suffering a problem with air power at this stage. So in that Zaporozhye area where airstrikes were used against the 82nd Air Assault and 71st Jaeger Brigades of the Armed Forces of Ukraine near Verbovo in Zaporozhye, up to 20 Ukrainian troops were lost and 2 motor vehicles were reportedly destroyed. The fighting around Robotne or Rabotino and Verbovo seems at this stage to be quite pointless for the Ukrainians. They've not been able to break through and advance past where they are now for 2 months. Even if they were to make a breakthrough here of the very first line, they are looking then outwards upon row of Russian defense lines before they even make it to Tokmak. So It feels as though now it's well past the time for the Ukrainians to have instead begun focusing on defensive positions and perhaps just holding the line and preparing to hold defensive positions behind Verbova instead of continuing to trying to take Verbova, which they seem incapable of being able to do. As you can imagine, lacking air support, that type of thing, lacking helicopter ability. Remember, helicopters don't just give you the ability to lay down missile and rocket strikes. They give you reconnaissance capability. They also give you mine laying ability. You can fly choppers out there dispersing thousands of mines very rapidly. If the Ukrainians can't do that, they're limited in their ability to mine areas to stop Russian advances. Moving down the Kherson region, and again, talking about what appears to be pointless activity. In Kherson, the Ukrainians have managed to establish a foothold on the left bank of the Dnieper River, near Krinky. However, I say it seems pointless because they are struggling to move any heavy equipment across. A day ago, there were reports of 11 barges being destroyed that were trying to move heavy equipment across. The men that are there across on the Russian side of the Dnieper River, reports are indicating, I heard Alexander Makuris reporting, that apparently they have a life expectancy of about 2 days there. Even if they establish a bridgehead there, they have no support from further north along the Dnieper River up into Zaporozhye. The closest point that they might have support there is around Pyatikhatki, where the Ukrainians have been pushed back, and then at Robotny and Verbova, again, the Ukrainians are not able to make any ground there. So this group of men, I feel it's purely symbolic so that the Ukrainian government can say, look, we've been able to get across the Dnieper and we're holding land there, but they're holding it at a terrible cost. And ultimately, I believe that those Ukrainian soldiers will either need to hopefully retreat and get away alive, or they will be killed in that location. All right, that's it for tonight. If you've watched it this far, thank you for watching the show. I hope you're enjoying the channel. If you are, please share it with people that you think might enjoy it. I've just hit 400 subscribers. I'm working towards getting to 1,000 subscribers. Please give it a like, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.